Okay, we're good. I'm sorry, David, what did you just say?
Oh, I have a copy. If you use the part of the cover when you were talking, I put one as a lesson to everybody watching. Always have a copy of your book. So
Yeah, and we do have it. In fact, Drew, you want to put that up real quick?
Sure, be glad to do that.
There we
there
go.
we are.
Woohoo!
See, that's the way it's done, folks. So
When did you write this book, David?
in the early, about 20 years ago, what was then the company's no longer in business. They publish a lot of fiction, how to write fiction magazines, and they used to do books about writing. And they asked me if I would do one, and it occurred to me that I've been a teacher, and I go to, I teach at conferences about writing, and that I'd never written about writing. So one of my idols as a writer is William Goldman, who is not only was not only one of our best screenwriters, but also a terrific novelist. The Princess Bride might be one that people know. Marathon Man is another one. Just a terrific writer. And he had done a book called Adventures in the Screen Trade, which is about how he became a screenwriter as well as a novelist, and how he survived in the movie business, working with rather high stress people, and sometimes having a good time, and sometimes it was tough for him. The tone of Adventures in the Screen Trade is as if you are he is speaking to you personally. It's a wonderful gift. And in fact, he did a couple more books about screenwriting. And in my admiration for him, I said, maybe I can use the same tone. So I hope that people feel that I'm speaking directly to them.
And the book is still available. Book is still in print?
Oh, yes, it's still in print, and there's an ebook as well, and an audio book.
How many novels have you written up to this point, David?
I don't count, but people sort of, it's not good, you don't want to look back. But I would say 28 novels is a fair guess. But then there are 3 collections of short stories. There's a book of essays, which called Stars in My Eyes, My Love Affair with Books, Movies, and Music. And it's about the authors who I felt so close to, that there was a relationship. And also I used to work for a magazine called Perfect Vision, which was about home video, and I would review a lot of what were then laser discs. And in the process would think about maybe doing essays, big essays, one about John Wayne, one about Marilyn Monroe, and one that I also wrote for their sister organization, Absolute Sound. So I did a long piece about Frank Sinatra. And so these are included in there as well, and a piece about Steve McQueen. And I really, really like writing essays. The personal essay is as it's sometimes called. So I think if you put them all together, there may be 33 books.
And that includes the 3 graphic novels you wrote for Marvel. So
I
you're all over the place. I mean, your scope of work, it's not just novels, it's very broad. And I think that's important. And that kind of plays into our discussion this evening, because I do want to talk with you about the difference of plotting a novel versus a short story.
Sure.
Before we get to that, though, David, I wanted to start by asking you, what to you is the difference between story and plot?
Well, in fact, in the writing book, I talk a lot about this. There are the king died. This is an old way of looking at it. The king died and the queen died. So when we turn that into a story, we say the king died and the queen died of grief. it's a lot to do with let me back up on that. People come to me often at social events and say, I have a great idea for a story. I'll just make something up. Russia invades the United States. Okay. And then they look very happy. And, you know, so all I have to do is write it because they gave me the idea. Well, yeah, there's a lot more to it than that. And a lot, much of it has to do with what are sometimes called twists in a story. But more than that, the conflict, one of the homilies that I use when I'm writing a story is to say that I have a character I want to explore and he has a goal and he has to fail a number of times before he has the strength and wisdom in order to succeed. So in my mind, it says my main character must fail in order to succeed. It's, you know, it's sort of like a haiku. And so in many ways, I think the terms are interchangeable. It's a, the key is to have conflict. There must be things to overcome or people to overcome. I did a book called Scavenger, which was the sequel to a novel of mine called Creepers. And as an example of the conflict, I structured it. I love to do experimental things. So I structured it like a video game. And there were 9 levels to the story. And in each level, the characters had to overcome an obstacle while at the same time solving a seemingly unsolvable riddle. And so there you had 9 conflicts. And I had a great time writing that book.
You were mentored early in your career by Philip Glass, who wrote science fiction under the pseudonym William Tenn. And I know that he was instrumental in you writing First Blood, your first novel.
Yes.
What did you learn from Philip Glass about plot? What kind of instruction did he give or insights did he give on that particular
Well,
topic?
he had been it was an odd thing. This was at Penn State where I did my graduate work. And it was an odd thing because Penn State actually hired a professional writer to teach writing, which is not always the case. And he had been a science fiction, he still was. He'd written for Playboy, he'd written for a lot of the big magazines, and he was known for inventing the comic science fiction story. And one of them is actually timely today. It's called The Masculinist Revolt, in which feminist ideas, this is back in the 50s, feminist ideas take over the world and men have to revolt in order to have their independence. It's a hilarious story. So I went to him and I'd already wanted to be a writer because of another writer who was a screenwriter, Sterling Silliphant, who had written most of the scripts for a TV series called Route 66 about 2 young men in a Corvette convertible driving across the United States in search of America and in search of themselves. That was the tag for it. And I was 17 at the time, and it spoke to me in a number of ways because one of the characters was always talking about busting out. He was a street kid. And that really spoke to me because I felt that a conventional life was not what I was destined for. And I had written a letter to Sterling to tell him that I wanted to be him, to do what he did. And he gave me some advice and about writing, which was to keep writing and keep writing and keep writing. And and if you were meant to be a writer someday, if you kept at it, somebody of influence would be able to help you. And so I quickly discovered, though, that it's difficult to earn a living as a writer. And I thought it wouldn't be bad to be in academia because you'd be with books, you'd be with bright people. So it was on that adventure that I wound up at Penn State, and I went to Philip Klass, who was the first professional writer I'd ever met. And I told him, I please teach me. And he said, well, go to my class here. I'll sign you up. And I said, no, no, no. Can you imagine how brazen I was? I said, no, no, I don't want that. I want you to teach me. And can we do something one-on-one? Well, years later, when I was a professor, like, that's impossible. Don't ask me to do that. And so he wanted to get rid of me. So he said, give me a short story a week and we'll see what happens. And I said, well, how long, how many weeks? He said, we'll see what happens. So I wrote a short story a week. And finally he called me into his office and he said, you've got to stop. This is terrible. These stories are horrible. No, I can't read another one. Just go away. So I was in despair, right? And I remember vividly that it was summer and I was at a desk with my typewriter and I was, what Philip Klass had said was that all of us have a dominant emotion. And that if we want to be distinctive writers, set apart, that we had to learn about ourselves and identify the distinctive emotion, and that would be our subject. And he looked at me and he said, I think your distinctive emotion is fear. And I had grown up in I'd been in an orphanage and lots of other things. And he was on the mark that was the emotion that drove me. And so he had told me to write stories about fear. And so I wrote stories about fear of drowning and fear of fires and fear of falling off heights and all that. And that wasn't what he meant. What he meant was that core, whatever fear itself is. And that's what I'd been doing. And I wound up at at this desk that summer. It was the summer of, I believe it was 67, and a long, long time ago. And I gave up. I was married, still am, same person, 55 years or whatever. I had a very young daughter, and I thought, why am I screwing around? Get the degrees, teach, earn some money, be nice to your family. And in that moment, something weird happened. I had an experience. I used to like to hike, and there was a place outside Penn State where there had been a mine that had collapsed and flooded, and the state turned it into a game preserve. And but you could hike there. So I used to go out there with my wife, and we'd carry our daughter, and we'd go around and look at things. And I was suddenly there. I was escaping, and I heard a sound behind me, and I turned, and I don't know what it was for, what it came from. And then I was hiking, and it was a narrow trail with bushes and trees hanging down, very claustrophobic. And I heard the sound again, and I knew that it was a footstep on a twig, that somebody was following me. And then as I moved forward, I heard the same sound ahead of me. So there were two of them, and they were coming, and I was turning like this to see. I didn't even know how to defend myself. And at that moment, I saw this typewriter in front of me, and I thought, what's this typewriter doing here? And then I realized that I had had the most powerful daydream that I'd ever experienced. And I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I wanted to find out how it ended. And I began typing. And it was a story called The Plinker, which is a slang term for people who like to target shoot. And even though he told me to get lost, I went back to Philip Glass with the story, and I said, "I have one more. Please look at it." And he looked at it, and well, he didn't read it immediately. He said, "All right, I'm sure you get out of my office." And about a week later, he phoned me and he said, "I want to meet you," but this time he didn't want to meet me in the office. This time he wanted to meet me in a coffee shop. And I thought, boy, this must really be bad that he's going to yell at me, and at least it won't be at the university. So I showed up and he said, "What happened to you?" And I told him the story, that not what was on the paper, but what was that daydream. And he began then to talk about how the key to finding your dominant emotion was through daydreams. That these are not something we can control. And we have a lot of them. And they come up to us, and they are, as it were, escape valves, that they are bubbling up from our subconscious. And he said that, the average person would have a daydream and either not be aware they were having a daydream, or else they would dismiss it as irrelevant. I remember in grade school, the teacher, I always had a capacity, I guess, for daydreaming, and I'd be looking out the window and the teacher would go crazy and say, "You're wasting all our time. There are 30 people in this room and we're distracted, and it's been 5 minutes. So you wasted 5 minutes times 30. So, okay. And there are, I know places and parents who feel that daydreaming is a bad thing. But in fact, I think that's where all the good ideas come from. And the trick is to be aware of them. It is to train yourself so that you are simultaneously, it's like you're watching a movie, as it were, and that they're happening and you're aware of them. I would often end a daydream. I don't much care for the pleasant ones. It's the ugly ones that I'm interested in. And why I would always ask myself, because some of it was really bad, and I think, where did that come from? And that where did it come from became the source of how I began to develop my ideas. And people are, if we're someplace and somebody, a general person would say, "Oh, that's interesting," and dismiss it. But in my case, or when I'm able to be one-on-one or with a group with teaching, when something interests you, you cannot dismiss it, because that's like the daydream. It's talking to you. It's getting at what you are. And just as a side note, one of the other things that Philip Glass said was that to be a writer who went the distance, we couldn't be imitating other people. And I put this into a mantra of that we have to be a first-rate version of ourselves and not a second-rate version of another author. I mean, there are lots of imitators, but they don't last, let's hope, 20 years. Or in my case, I cannot believe it. My career has lasted 50 years. And it doesn't happen that way. And one of the reasons it did for me was that I always followed my perception of who I was and that dominant emotion. And I'm known as for writing First Blood and Rambo, outdoor adventure, let us say some military action. But that was only for the first 10 years of my career. The second 10 years, I wrote espionage novels. And on and on and on. In the 2010s, I was writing historical Victorian thrillers. In the Victorian era, they were called sensation novels. The origin of thrillers, as we know them, is the sensation novels of the Victorian era. And I determined that I was going to write an imitation Victorian sensation novel. And I loved doing it so much, I wrote 3 of them about a real life person of the period named Thomas de Quincey, who had been part of the founder of the sensation movement. As another writer who I know who shall go unnamed, but has written the same thing and has experienced the falling off as readers get used to a certain thing. He looked at me and he said, "You son of a fill in the blank, you reinvented yourself again." And I'm hearing voices.
Yeah, hold on a second.
Oh,
There we go. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's all right. So getting back to this daydream, the daydream is telling you, and not all of them are fruits for stories, but boy, it's amazing how many of my daydreams wound up becoming novels or short stories. And it was always about, I wonder why I find that interesting. Philip Klass used to talk about writing fiction as a form of self-psychoanalysis. And as he said, by being yourself, you have a better chance of competing in the publishing world, because if you can be unique, that doesn't always, of course, mean that what you write will appeal to a lot of people, but by being unique, at least you set yourself aside and you're not a follower. Anytime you have a daydream and you say, "I wonder where that came from," boy, that's gold. You know, you say to yourself, "All right, what is that about?" And there's a technique I like to recommend to everybody, and it's in my writing book, and I call it a conversation with myself. And what I do, if I have an idea that's, you know, of some ideas, that is to say, daydreams and what have you, I'll say, "Oh, that's, I don't know. It's not, I don't think there's anything in there." You know, you can store these things in your memory, but the ones that come back to me again and again and again, the example I love to use is, I was reading, I don't know how I came across it, an article in Architectural Digest. And years ago, they used to do 1 issue a year about celebrities and their houses. And in this case, as I flipped through, the house was one that was owned by the silent movie star Ramon Navarro. And his house had been designed by the son of Frank Lloyd Wright. And it looked like a Mayan temple, kind of a pyramid. It wasn't quite a pyramid, but I was stunned by the photos and of him in his house, because these were photos that were taken at the time when he lived there. And I couldn't get over, I kept coming back to the photos. I kept looking at them and I thought, what's talking to me here? And it took me a very, very long time before I realized that I was freaking out literally by the fact that I finally realized that I associated photographs with death. That if you are, when we look at photos, we say, "Oh, look, that's the way it was?" And look at, you know, Aunt Miriam, look at how young she was then. Or look at how young I was then. Or, you know, that tree, look at how it's grown since we took the photograph. A photograph freezes time. And I decided that I was going to write a novel about photography, a thriller about photography. And I have this technique that when I have an idea that's bothering me, I start to write a letter to myself or a written conversation with myself. And you know, I start off, there's two of me, and I start off with my alter ego saying, how are you this morning, David? And I say, oh, I'm just fine. So why are we here? The other person says, well, I have this idea and I'm trying to understand it. And I thought if we had a conversation about it. And so the left brain, right brain, as it were, part of me, then has a conversation which can last several days. Some of these conversations, these written conversations, have gone on for 30 single-spaced pages, and they function as a kind of free-flowing outline. And I'm always, the other part of me is always pushing myself to say, so what? Who cares? Or so what? Or explain more, or you're not being clear. And I try to answer. The beauty of this is not only that I'm thinking through with words rather than talking to somebody, because if I'm talking to somebody, the words go in the air. But if I'm putting the words on the page, then I'm writing at the same time that I'm thinking about the story. And the extra benefit is that two of them actually, because writing is a perishable skill. So if you can, as long as you're writing, trying to discover the story, it's keeping the tools sharp. And then the third advantage is that in the event that you have a significant interruption in your life, a death, loss of a job, catastrophe, flood, fire, friend gets mortally sick, whatever, you can come back. This has happened to me. You can come back 3 months, 6 months, a year later, and read the progress of your thoughts and get up to speed in one afternoon. And this doesn't work unless you're honest with yourself and saying that you still haven't told me why you think this is so interesting. You would write a book about it. And for me, the breakthrough, I think maybe on day 3, was to understand that subconsciously, whenever I looked at a photograph, I saw time frozen, which was another way of talking about death. And so that became the novel. And then the question is, how do you write about photography? Well, you do a photographer. And then I said that, by process, you're talking about this on the page. So how do you, what kind of photographer? Because I write thrillers. So what kind of, well, a war photographer, obviously. So that would be how we started, with a war event that the photographer was documenting. And then the thought occurred to me, these photographs would make him so disgusted that he was using his talent for this, that he would walk away from that profession and try to be a fine art photographer and enter that world, only to find that his past had caught up to him. And that was basically the structure of the story. And once you have something like that, then it's a matter of filling in the gaps.
What was the resulting novel?
It was called Double Image. And it was written for research. I took photography classes. This is in the day of film, not digital. So I took photography classes. I read everything I could about the great, since he was an American, it was going to be American photographers, and the guy had to know the history of photography. So I had to learn all that. Some of you may know that I'm known for my in-depth research, almost method acting research. And one of the most interesting parts of the research was at that time, I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is an artist's town, a photographer's town. And Ansel Adams used to come through here, and many other famous photographers. And there was at that time a photography shop that they sold fine art prints called the Andrew Smith Gallery. And I went down, and this is, it's not our topic today, but mean, people love to talk about what they're doing. And if you go in and say, I'm a writer and I want to I'm hoping to write a book about what you do, and I hope that maybe we could have a conversation, people, and I'm sure you've seen, you would say, books that get it all wrong about what you do. So if you help me, I'll try to get it right. And well, oh boy, they'll just absolutely help you. So I introduced myself to the staff, and I said, can you tell me why this photograph is worth $50,000? So they would go through the artist, and then they would go through the image and the history, and it was fascinating. And I said to them, would you mind if every Saturday I came down, and you know who I am, so I'm not a customer, although I did in fact buy some photographs. But I said, I'm not there to be a customer. What I'd like to do is kind of go around and look at the various photographs and listen to you tell potential clients why such and such a photograph is important. And so I absorbed all this. So the book was it was a thriller, but it was also about photography. And of course, once you do that, now you're thinking about what movies, there aren't many novels about photography, but lots of movies or comparable ones. So now you have, say, Blow Up, in which a photographer takes a picture, and as he blows it up, he sees evidence of a murder. And of course, there are audio versions of that, The Conversation by Francis Ford Coppola, and Brian De Palma did one called Blow Out, because he just loves to, in which they hear things on tape, which leads them to reinterpret reality. And so there was a big scene in this book where a photograph that our main character had taken would be, oh boy, that he would understand through the photo. And Steven Spielberg did a movie about his experience, The Fabelmans, but I didn't think he handled it right. I think it was so obvious what was going to be recorded on the movie that made the difference in the character's life, that when he watched the movie and saw it, we'd already seen it in real life. There was no revelation. It was obvious. So, there's a trick in how to do this. So anyway, double image was so chosen because in those days with film, you could have a double exposure. So then I thought, because this is the way I think, I thought, well, I wonder if it's possible to create a double exposure in a novel. Is it possible to have two plots on top of each other? And I didn't want to call it double exposure, which is pretty obvious. So double image became the book. And the conversation with myself was very lengthy. And in fact, I reprint that part of it, at least in the writing book, to explain this technique and how valuable it is. And of all the lessons that I have imparted to people that were important to me, that have really helped me, the most comments I get are about this written conversation, that many authors have found it extremely useful. You don't have to talk, you don't talk to somebody and say, well, I got an idea for a story. And by the time you've done, it's all in the ozone and you don't have the urge to write the story. This is writing about writing the story, and which is its own art form. So anyway, I droned on quite a lot there. So
let's talk for a moment, David, about First Blood, your first novel. You and I have spoken, I've talked to you, interviewed you about how the novel came to be, and we've talked a little bit about the challenges you faced and your decision to actually tell the story in alternating chapters.
Yes.
Rambo gets a chapter, Teasel gets a chapter, you go back and forth, and it all kind of really comes together at the end. When you were plotting that book, your very first novel, what was the most challenging aspect of the plot, of putting the plot together, of telling the story. At the very beginning, before you started writing, what was challenging for you? What was the most difficult part?
Well, first of all, I had the benefit of advice from Philip Klass. And also, Philip Klass was a client of an agent named Henry Morrison. And one other client of Henry Morrison was Donald E. Westlake, the great crime writer and comic crime writer. As Donald Westlake, he invented the crime caper. But as Richard Stark, he invented he didn't invent it, but they're about as hard-boiled crime as you can get with a professional thief named Parker. And they became a lot of movies. Lee Marvin was in one called Point Blank. Anyhow, they were very helpful to me. And we start with first principles. Again, something interests you instead of a normal person, because we're not normal. A normal person would dismiss it and say, well, that's fine. But I was at Penn State. I wanted to be a writer. I'd done the Plinker story for Philip Klass, and he said, he would work with me, and I didn't have, you need to do a novel. And one night, I was watching the CBS Evening News at a time when it was just starting. Walter Cronkite, we're used to evening news programs. CBS Evening News was the first. And he was doing, this would have been in '68, he was doing, the lead story was about the Vietnam War. And the second story was about the hundreds of riots that were occurring in American cities. It's hard for people who didn't live at the time to understand that there weren't 10 or 50 or 100 riots in 1968. There were several hundred riots, and many cities did not recover to this day. Inner Detroit, inner LA, and there are others. And as the story segued from Vietnam to National Guardsmen patrolling burning streets in the United States, I thought, my God, it's the same war. It's as if the war had come home. And wham, I said to myself, that could be a novel. A veteran comes back to learn what he has been fighting for in Vietnam. And he grows a beard, he has long hair. In effect, he looks like a war protester. And he gets rousted time after time after time by police, which is what happened. That it was a cultural thing at the time that if you had long hair and a beard, you were going to have trouble. And I imagined finally, once too often, that he would say, I'm not going to take it anymore. And in effect, his anger at what he had learned from what had happened to him in the war would erupt. So that was basically the concept, and it happened to me quickly. It happened within a little bit of time, that watching that news program, and then afterward thinking about it. And at the same time, I suddenly remembered that as a teacher, because Penn State hired me to teach introductory writing, essay writing, to first-year students so they could write papers for their professors. And that's the way I could afford to go to Penn State, because I had a stipend and a tuition for doing this work. And I had students who resisted and resented me, young men, almost my age, who had come back from Vietnam and wanted to know how the hell I could give them orders. That's not how I teach, but that's how they saw it. And why hadn't I been in Vietnam? And I asked them to stay after class. And I said, look, I'm Canadian. I'm an American citizen now, but I was Canadian at the time. I am married. I have a very young infant. There's no way I'm going to be drafted for the Vietnam War. So once they got the idea that they were talking to a foreigner, so to speak, they began telling me what it had been like to come back and the loud noises that made them jump for cover, the problems with alcohol, with drugs, with relationships, with sleeping, those who had been in combat, mind you. And so I began to get a picture of Rambo as a version of what they were talking to me about, but he was a Medal of Honor recipient that the character would be. I wanted him to be very, very up in the echelon. And then the final thing that came together was that I was thinking about other veterans, and I'm of an age where everybody knew who Audie Murphy was, A-U-D-I-E, Murphy. A young man from Texas who entered the Second World War and became America's most decorated soldier of that era. And his citation for his Medal of Honor makes Rambo look like a piker. It's incredible what Audie Murphy, this little guy, did in the Second World War.
He was
And
capturing
so,
Germans by the hundreds, if I recall.
yes, 250 of them at one time. And that was after his unit was pinned down, and he grabbed I can't remember, it was a submachine gunner. If it would have been hard for him to carry the real thing. But he went up, he charged the hill and forced everybody to surrender. I mean, that was just one of the things he did. He was on a burning military vehicle with a machine gun as Germans approached, and he was defending his unit, which had been shot up pretty badly. And I don't know how many people he killed that day, 50. I mean, it's a terrible story. We honor bravery, but he was like, in later he became a movie star, principally in westerns, and whenever he got into an action sequence, you saw when he was handling the guns, you saw a darkness in his eyes, that like it was as if he was back there. And so and he had trouble, he had what we now call post-trauma stress disorder. In those days it was shell shock or battle fatigue or whatever. And he had a problem. He carried a gun with him, and he pistol whipped people, and he shot up, but he woke up from nightmares shooting up rooms and things like that. And so the final thing that came together was that I said to myself, what if my guy from Vietnam is Audie Murphy? And what if he grew a beard and long hair? And what if they roasted him? What would Audie Murphy do? So there was a kind of an amusement in the idea. So that was the idea. So, all right. So now I made the beginner's mistake of being insecure about how to start the book. And I started with a big action scene. I started with, in the story, Rambo is arrested, he escapes, he goes into the mountains, and a posse goes after him, and they think they're fighting Korea and he's fighting Vietnam. And you know who's going to win in that kind of thing. And I got to back up now. I got distracted from, oh, yes. So I thought to myself, no one's going to be patient with me, so I'm going to start with the helicopter chasing Rambo. And I wrote maybe 50 pages of that. And it was a total failure because we didn't know who Rambo was. We didn't know who the guys in the helicopter were. We didn't know who the people chasing him were. We didn't know why they were chasing him. What was I thinking? And it was Donald Westlake who read, Philip Klass had given him this early draft, and Don said, no, you gotta, you get back, starting with a flashback is never a good idea. So, get back to the first moment when these two people meet. Suddenly a sentence came to mind. His name was Rambo, and he was just some nothing kid for all anybody knew. And the words began to follow from that. But I had spent maybe 9 months on this other version. And so now I was being asked to start all over again, but I knew in my heart that this could be because of the Vietnam War that was going on, and because I wanted to write an action book that didn't have all the cliches of the shot rang out. I wanted to write an action book as if it hadn't been written before. And so when I had that sentence, and in fact, we could do a whole session on how the first sentence, the first paragraph, and the first page will make or break your book, because they establish the tone. And editors don't wait 25 pages. They want now an immediacy, and most of the time it's tone. We don't need to start with, the axe came at him and he leapt over the table to escape it. None of that stuff, and his name was Rambo, and he was just some nothing kid for all anybody knew. Well, raises all kinds of questions. Like, there's something about this guy that's more than just something kid. And we're going to learn about this. And the cop pulls up and stops. So now we have the confrontation scene on bottom of page 1, as I recall. And so I straightened it all out. And then my second draft was chronological, but I didn't have control of the narrative. And there were digressions because I thought I was maybe writing about the town as well as everything else and what was happening to the town. So there were digressions for one of the deputies and what his life was like. Were digressions about what was going on in the courthouse. And I mean, I thought wonderful scenes, but the book was not working. And at the end of the second draft, I remember looking through this and saying, man, I've been wasting my time. And then I had this idea. I said, what if I read through until I feel my attention is waning? Now, in the age of computers, that's easier to do. I had to write my hands are all messed up from all that. But what you do is you change the font. And I always print my manuscripts and read them analog versions and make my revisions analog and then put them into the digital world. So I'm always looking analog, digital, changing fonts at the end of each draft, and never reading the pages at the same place where I write. Always going somewhere else so that I don't have the association of the locale. And so I remember vividly, it was my wife and daughter were away, and in despair, I was on our living room sofa, nothing sofa. I can still remember the holes in it. And I was reading through, and there's Rambo and there's Teasel, and there's Rambo and there's Teasel. And then there's the deputy, and I'm thinking, what the hell is this deputy doing here? Why did I write this? And I said, this doesn't. So I said, what would happen if I took out these 10 pages? Now that's heartbreaking. I mean, that's how long? Oh my God. And then I started over, and it required a lot of concentration to trick myself into being somebody else, being Don Westlake, being Henry Morrison, being Philip Klass. And by then I was teaching at the University of Iowa, so I didn't have Phil to rely on. So I read through, and by God, it just went smoothly. And then all of a sudden there's the justice of the peace and I get 10 pages on him. What was I thinking? Out that goes. Start over again. And then I knew, I get it. The structure is Rambo Teasel, Rambo Teasel, Rambo Teasel, Rambo Teasel. And I realized by doing it that way, we do not know who to cheer for. We think while we're reading Rambo that Teasel is wrong. We think when we're reading Teasel that Rambo is wrong, which is the theme of the book. How if we don't try hard, if we don't try to understand the other point of view, we're going to have some bad times. And so relatively easily then, after that afternoon, yanking, I was able to put together, remembering I'm typing on an electric typewriter. But I was able to put together the draft that went to Henry Morrison relatively soon, a couple of weeks. But it's a classic case of you do not know what you've written until afterward. You do, and there have been several books I wrote which I thought were going to be one thing, and when it was all done, and I was like with the clay to mold it, I said, "Oh, this isn't the book I thought I was writing. It's another book. And if I do this and this and this is a good book. If you'll forgive me, you have to say that to yourself. Otherwise, why are you doing this?" So that basically was my methodology. And then years later, I developed this technique of the conversation with myself. So I'm kind of teaching myself, as it were, of being honest with myself. And that then was sort of a accumulation of everything that I'd learned from, these wise people.
Were you at the University of Iowa the same time that Kurt Vonnegut was teaching there?
No, I came later, and we have to realize I was not in the writer's workshop, and the writer's workshop did not like me. When I published First Blood and other books, I was not writing what they considered to be workshop-worthy fiction. This is, I'm not trying to be nasty about this. It's a common issue in writers' workshops. They're at a university, and often what they're looking for are kind of a New Yorker kind of writer. Joe Haldeman, a gifted science fiction writer, multiple awards and what have you, he was accepted into the workshop, but he had to lie. He could not have said that he was a science fiction writer. I'm talking about now in the 1960s. I have no idea what the workshop is like now. For all I know, it's an entirely different thing. But in the day, they did not. Stephen King was a friend of mine, and he asked me. He said, I've always wanted to be in a writer's workshop teaching. He said, well, you go to them and say that I would like to teach there for 6 months. And I went to the head of the writer's workshop at the time and said, Stephen King would like to teach here. Would you be interested in accepting, at least his application? And I was told, you've got to be kidding. But I did not teach in the workshop. I have a doctorate in American literature. My dissertation was on the postmodernist novelist John Barth. So that's something to wrap our minds around, that the creator of Rambo is a Barth expert. So I taught in the English department. I taught American literature, principally courses in the American novel, and occasionally seminars in Melville and Hawthorne and Hemingway and Faulkner and people like that, one on Barth. And on one occasion about the study of myth as a way of understanding literature. So talking about Joseph Campbell and people like that. And I taught there for 16 years. I was a full professor when I left. So I was not associated with the workshop. Wow. Vonnegut had been there earlier. So I did have friends in the workshop. We socialized the teachers, and some of them at least. Vance Bourgeli was a friend He could write nonfiction. He wrote a book about hunting called The Unnatural Enemy, which the attitudes of which I used a lot in First Blood, because I'm not a hunter. Eventually, Kurt came back. Joseph Heller was there. Jorge Luis Borges was there as a teacher, not as a lecturer, rather. I'm trying to think of some of the others. I was
It was a heck of a lineup. It really
I was
was.
privileged at cocktail parties to be able to meet these people. John Cheever was actually on the faculty for a time. And I've had several conversations with him. Very interesting man, of course, a great writer, but he's exactly what the workshop would have looked for at the time.
Right.
A New Yorker.
Very New Yorker.
Yes, exactly. So, and again, I don't want anybody listening here saying I went around badmouth the Iowa Writers Workshop. I'm
No.
talking about the way my perception of it in the 1960s. And I remember once I went to the head of that department and said, I'm getting a lot of people coming to me from the workshop asking me to read their contracts because they don't know how to read a contract. And I was thinking maybe I could do a couple of workshops about how to read contracts and how to get agents. And once again, no, we're not a business. We're an artist. We're artists. So okay.
Let's talk a little bit about short stories. We've been talking about novels, but you've also written short stories.
Yes.
When it comes to plot, long form versus short form, how does your approach differ? If you're writing a short story compared to a novel, when we're talking about story, we're talking about plot, we're talking about narrative. How is your approach different for the two forms?
Well, a short story is about compression. I've written, again, it's one of those where I've lost count, probably 70 short stories. And but this sounds like a lot, but over 50 years, it's not a lot. The problem with shorts, the first story I wrote, which is called The Dripping, which was published by Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine as my first published story. And I became part of the Ellery Queen Firsts department. And you wouldn't believe the authors who are Ellery Queen Firsts. Jack Finney, I think, is one of them. And I was so pleased to do that. And that story came to me in a dream, which occasionally, a real dream, not a daydream. And I wrote it in one afternoon. It was 3,000 words. So, it can be done. Would that they would come to me like that all the time. But in most cases, I get an idea, and then the problem begins, because a short story is compression. So a word in a short story counts 10 times, 50 times more than it does in a novel. I can do when I'm hot, I can do 5 pages a day of a novel. They need fixing, but they're respectable. So I could do 25 pages in a week, because I usually do not, unless I'm under deadline, work on the weekend, because it just makes you stale if you do. But in order to write those 25 pages as a short story, it can take me a month. So I've really got to love the idea for the story in order to commit myself to doing it. And usually when I write the stories, it's between novels, when I want to clear my head and I don't want to start something big, but I'd like to do something that's going to exercise me. But a month, okay, if that's how long it's going to take, I'll commit to that. And then I come back and I can really go for the marathon with a novel. But the problem is how you can get that first sentence from which everything else will follow, and do it in a I tend to believe to be a lean writer anyhow, but to do it in a way that is lean, and will get a number of things done in a hurry. And I think my favorite form would be the novella. I've written several novellas, about 15,000, 20,000 words. There you've got the room. You don't have to be so compressed, and often they won't sustain themselves for 90,000 words, but they, but I really like the experience of having written the novellas, but the short stories, and they tend to come in around 3,000 words, but you'd never know the anguish
Yeah.
for the compression. So it's really it's a difference of attitude. It's, that you're a different writer, at least I am, when I'm doing a short story.
It sounds like you spend a lot of time on that first sentence, especially with a short story, because you have the economy of words for this in a short form narrative, so that you have to reach out and grab the reader by the throat with that opening sentence and make them say, I really need to know more.
Often, though, it's not, again, the temptation, especially for a beginning writer, and I made that error, is you want to have the axe came at him and he leaped across the table to escape it. I mean, it's no. What you want, my experience, is tone matters. Philip Glass used to, in those days, there were big bookstores that would have the week's new releases or the month's new releases, and that's not, Barnes and Noble used to do that. They don't do that so much anymore. But he sent me down to the local university bookstore, to the fiction department, and he said, I want you to read the first sentence, the first paragraph, the first page, only those, of every novel that's on the rack, and do that once a week. And I learned two things. One was that 90% of them felt as if they'd been written by the same person. They had the same affect. And after I looked at one or two, and they were all professional, but I looked and I said, I can't stand to look at another one by whoever this person is. But 10% of them would be unexpected. They have a tone that grabbed me, in a way storytelling is mesmerizing, it's hypnotizing. And they would give me a tone that I wanted to be in, that I wanted to go with. I'm reminded of a Hemingway short story called In Another Country. And the first sentence is, in the fall, the war was always there, but we did not go to it anymore. Oh, this is the first, my thriller author hero is a man named Geoffrey Household, a British writer. His name is spelt with a G, Geoffrey. He wrote a book called Rogue Male about a British big game hunter that stops Hitler on the eve of the Second World War, and he wrote it on the eve of the Second World War. And this is how it begins. I cannot blame them. After all, one does not need a telescopic sight to shoot boar or bear. Therefore, when they came upon me watching the building at a range of 150 yards, it was natural enough for them to jump to conclusions. And he's caught on the first page. And the story actually turns out to be his escape. Oh, I'm breathtaking when you can see how it mattered to me so much. The beginning of James M. Cain's Postman Always Rings Twice. They threw me off the hay truck around noon. So what was he doing on the hay truck? Why did they throw him off? Well, I want to know. And so whatever springboard we have for tone, or just an odd way of putting it, in the fall, the war was always there, but we did not go to it anymore. It's not we didn't go to it anymore, but we did not go to it anymore. This is a guy who learned from Gertrude Stein about rhythm in sentences. And I think, what we're looking for, and we shouldn't be insecure. Sometimes the sentence comes to us right away, But I'm trying to write something now, what's called a bibliomystery. A man who runs a mystery bookstore and publishes pamphlets that are sold with books, or that if you're a member of his book club, you get a free. It's Otto Penzler at the Mysterious Bookstore in New York. And I've been trying to write a biblio, and I have the idea, but it's 10,000 words. And every approach I've had feels like a novel. And I keep cutting back. I said, where does the story begin? So that I don't have all this backstory to peddle, and that I can get right into it in order to move along. And it's driving me nuts, but it, on the other hand, keeps me off the streets.
Well, that segues nicely to my last question for you, David. I was hoping that you could recommend which authors to you really excel when it comes to plotting. You know what I mean? And who would you recommend? You just mentioned some authors, some great opening sentences, some opening lines for various stories and books. But when it comes down to authors who do it really exceptionally well, who would you recommend that we take a look at?
Well, I would have to go back to the Victorians. I mean, I spent
Really,
10
that
years
all the way.
in the Victorian world. Well, they were, it was built into the form that they would sell books in like 3 volumes. The length mattered. And so you could either have and then happened and then happened and then happened, or else you could structure an interconnected story. And Dickens, of course, something like Bleak House, which was one of my models, that was, I mean, it's a masterpiece of plotting, not to mention it's formally inventive because half of it's in the third person omniscient and half of it's in the first person. And so when I did my Victorian Murder as a Fine Art and the other books, I knew I had to have a first person in there as well as an omniscient, because that's what Dickens did. But I don't know if any better plotter perhaps than Wilkie Collins. The Woman in White is, I think, a masterpiece. And I'm reading the best of the Victorian era. Or Trollope. Trollope's an exceptional plotter, and it's big. Now these days, because we live in a time of limited attention spans, what we mean by plot isn't perhaps what the Victorians meant. So if you're, looking for something current, I was very impressed by Gillian Flynn's
Gone Girl?
Gone Girl, yes. Because first of all, again, it's formally inventive, as she more or less made popular years after Henry James pioneered it. He made popular the unreliable first person narrator. James said, whenever you have a first person narrator, you have to suspect the person. And so she did something that had, it's even 14 years, I think that was published in 2008 or 9, years later, that's still having an effect. But she, in addition to, and she alternates as well, but the viewpoints, but also she, I'm trying to remember what the second point was, just a minute. Oh, yes, in the structure, in the plot, she also emphasized the twists. We think we have one thing going and zip, it's something different, and then it happens again and it happens again. I did this in Creepers way back in 2005. The main character we think we understand, and in the second third of the book, we realized in the first part, we were all misinformed. We really didn't understand him. Now we do understand him. And then in the third part of the book, once again, he goes through three layers of his personality before we understand who he is. But I'm a big admirer of Gone Girl. Plus, it was a kind of description of a certain phenomenon in, let us say, early 30s aged people who had set out to have careers, and the 2008 recession destroyed them all. And in a way, that book is about two people who had to come back to their hometown from where they've been successful in New York and feel in a way, the indignity of having retreated. And I thought that was, and coming home to your parents, you know, that, so I thought there was a lot of social overtones there, and which is all this is rare for a popular, you know, a best-selling book. But if you want to, you know, just Collins is extraordinary, and the Moonstone as well. You know, the Moonstone, not as well, is, you know, and he was, of course, a best friend to Dickens. So, you know, so there was a lot there.
Those are great recommendations.
But ultimately, of course, we are ourselves. And, you know, my mantras are: be a first-rate version of yourself, not a second-rate version of another author, and don't chase the market. You'll always see its backside. And today, especially, we have to keep that in mind, because a phenomenon named Colleen Hoover has taken over the bestseller list. It used to be that if you had a #1 paperback and #1 hardback simultaneously, oh boy. But Colleen Hoover has had as many as 7 simultaneous bestsellers on the ebook print list, sometimes a book on the print hardback list, and sometimes 7 or 8 on the trade paperback list and on the audio list. Now, this changes from week to week. And what has happened is she writes women, she's a female author writing about women, and often with issues of race or gender or raising families, adultery, problems with children. She really is, she's speaking to a heck of a lot of readers. I've never seen anything like it. And this has been going on for more than a year. And the consequence is that agents and editors want Colleen Hoover clones. You do not want to be a Colleen Hoover clone. You want to be yourself. So what you do is you outweight it and you write what you must write now. And as it wanes, you can, and somebody says, you know, we're sick of this, what else? Suddenly you're fresh. And if your business is writing, if your goal is to write stories that are important to you, it won't matter if you're not published this month or next month. It matters that you get the satisfaction of writing a story, a novel that you're proud of. And this will change, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. And I say, Google Colleen Hoover, and you will see, and then look at the New York Times bestseller lists, and you will see that if Colleen isn't on it, the clones are. And I personally feel sort of that I'm out of the game right now, because I've taken novels, I've pitched ideas to agents and editors who have told me 5 years ago, terrific, but there's no market for it now because what we want is Colleen Hoover. And it's just, it's the business.
Yeah.
It's the way it is. It's like if you're in the movie business, if you're not in a superhero movie, you don't exist. I mean, it comes and goes. And what's very important for us is that we're not in it for the ego. A lot of people want to be being writers because they want to, people tell them they're wonderful. Well, it doesn't happen very often, folks. And some of them want to be in the business. And now I'm talking about business, not art. Because they want to be rich and famous. Well, those days were in the 90s. These days, that Barnes and Noble thinks it's being wise if they order for their entire chain 4,000 copies of a new book. And they like that if they can return 3,600 copies of a 4,000 book, if they can return if they can sell 3,600 copies of 4,000, they're happy. Where an editor and I were talking about this, whereas at 20,000, if they only sell 12,000 copies, they're not happy because they got to return 8,000 and it's just a mess, right? So it's different. In the 90s, if you had a mass market paperback, you probably were going to sell 500,000 copies. And that's not possible now. For a variety of reasons. And if that's discouraging to some of you, then maybe you weren't cut out to be writers. Because if you're a writer, this thing is in your head and you have to put it on the page.
That's Taft, David.
Yeah.
The majority of the people in this organization write because they have to. You know what I mean? It's in their blood, it's in our genes. We've got stories to tell, and whether it sells or not, we got to put that story down.
Yes, and somebody I saw, somebody had written a sentence down here on my screen, and they were referring to the Kindle revolution, which started in 2009, and the years they have are 2010 to 2012. And oh boy, could you sell ebooks in those 2 years?
That's
Now there are 800,000 ebooks published each year.
Yeah,
How
it's a
can
fire
you
hose.
shout loud? How can you shout loud? And that's where, you find, I mean, now it's a different topic, how you publicize your, you go online and you find the nonfiction subject of your book and you seek out websites that would be interested in that topic and go to them and say, can I publicize my material through you and things like that. I have a thing about this in the writing book as well. And I'm on the one hand, I want to be realistic for young writers, beginning writers. It is possible, as in to use Colleen Hoover as an example, because she is herself. No one else could write a Colleen Hoover book as well as Colleen Hoover. And she came along at exactly the right time. So, we are, if we're doing this right, we're with people who are generous spirits and also writers, and we're enjoying the fellowship and we're enjoying the conversations and we're enjoying what we do and we're excited about what we do. And yes, we have hope that this will become, first blood. But on the other hand, one has to be aware of what is happening in the real world, and to take a look at the New York Times book review. The two thrillers that were really promoted and reviewed in last Sunday's New York Times book review, what distinguished them, what the authors of the reviews chose was the social themes. One was about a Black police officer in a white town, and the other was about gender confusion, a thriller about gender confusion. And these themes, it seems as if the reviewers think that social themes are thought. And while they're important, novels are more than that, and ideas are more than that. And novels in some ways are about the form in which we put them and how we change our perception of the world because of them. So a different topic, and I hope nobody's having a nervous breakdown, but it is useful to know who called.
Well, if you don't know how the game is played, if you don't know how the business is played, if you don't know the history of what we're doing, you're at a severe disadvantage.
Yes, that is correct. And that's on one side, but I mean, I'm primarily writing books that I want to write.
Right.
And I've never written a book because an editor suggested I write it. And I've never written a book that I thought I mean, when I did the Victorian books, oh boy, the upcry. What have you done? Why would you do that? But my agent went to an editor who was then at Mulholland Books, and he looked at it and he went to the head of his division of Little Brown, and this is the story I was told. He said, I don't know if we'll make money on it, but this is a book you should publish. And, and that's what we want, is to affect people, that somebody reads the book and says, an editor, an agent says, oh, wow. And it might not be right now, but you're on my radar. We have a relationship, and that's how careers are built.
Well, let's take a couple of minutes for some audience questions, David. Does anyone have any questions for David on plotting or any other aspect of writing or publishing? Anybody? Meg?
I have a question, more of just to see if you would be interested in playing with it, because you do like the conversation with yourself strategy. Have you toyed with the idea of trying to use Bard or ChatGPT to have that conversation typed out with AI?
I would not do that. First of all, I wish I could remember the author's name. He talked about some of us are of an age where we're digital immigrants and we speak digital with an accent. So I think I'm great if I can do a little bit on Twitter or on Facebook. No, because the whole point of that, of the writing the letter, is that you're expressing yourself. It's not, and that's how you're discovering things. So, and I think what this written conversation is going to, I don't know what it would look back as it came back from an AI source. But I mean, I think of these, somewhere in those programs, there's an evil personality that's going to just absolutely destroy my story and destroy me and declare war against the Russians at the same time. I mean, as somebody said to me the other day, we're doomed, because if AI gets in to make decisions that we can't control, it's not going to be pleasant. So, and so the simple answer is no. What we want to do is put our personality on the page.
And your interview is really two parts of your brain. So
Right.
The AI thing would be a different person, like you're having a conversation with a stranger, kind of, and they don't understand what you, and it wouldn't understand what you were trying to do with that exercise. So you're talking to yourself.
It's like, and and I remember speaking to don't tell people what you do, because they'll always ask questions that annoy you. And I was on a plane once with somebody, and stupidly the person said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a writer and author." "Oh, what's it like?" I said, "Well, the interesting thing is when, sometimes the characters assume lives of their own and they tell me what to do." And so she began leaning away from me, and it turned out she was a clinical psychologist. And she thought she was sitting next to a serial killer. So, not everybody understands how weird we are.
It's true. I say that all the time, David. If people who aren't writers, they think they know what we do, but they really don't know what
we're really messed up, man.
I I write for an hour and then I eat bonbons and watch TV and go to parties. That's pretty much it.
Oh yeah, it's the parties, right?
Yeah, nonstop parties for writers, man. It's awesome.
Yes. I knew someone who married an author under the mistaken impression that it was glamorous. No, the marriage lasted like 6 months. And she said, "Well, where are the parties?" "Well, and he said, "I mean, why are you going into that office all the time?"
Does anyone else have any questions for David?
Great story.
This is an awesome opportunity. Elisa?
I don't have a question. I just want to thank you for reiterating that be the best first-rate version of yourself, because and nodding my head the whole time you talked about Colleen Hoover, because the interesting thing is the publishing industry is a little bit hypocritical, because they will give the advice, don't chase the trends.
Yeah.
But the most recent novel that I independently published went through a 2-year submission.
Yep.
And one of the main reasons my agent finally said, well, they're looking for the Colleen Hoover, and that just what, it was, they weren't saying I had a bad story. They weren't saying it was poorly written. They weren't saying, they were just saying, I don't think the market wants it right now. And my answer, which is why I had started independently publishing way, way back when, is, my response to that was, well, I can sell it. I know what it is. I know, I think I know how to find the readers for this, or how to bring it, bring the readers to it. And yeah, and even once in a while, I put this in the chat, that once in a while somebody says, well, why aren't you writing Colleen Hoover books? And I said, because I'm not Colleen Hoover.
You're not,
you know
it's so wise. You're so
Yeah.
wise. And I know people, when there were the medical thrillers were the big deal. And I knew people were imitating Robin Cook, and a few of them, they sold the novels. But what do you do then?
Right.
So when the trend changes, what other trend you're going to chase? And after a while, editors saying, well, it's a hack. So yeah, because a self-published is one way to go, and also remembering independent publishers, small presses.
Right.
I've published several things with small presses that I knew weren't what a major house would want, but I wanted to write it, and I knew that I could find something for it. So unlike before 2009, we do have access, we do have ways to put our novels or stories out there without relying on the problem that you said. They say they don't want to chase the trend, but they do chase the trend. And there is a certain hypocrisy, but that's what business is. And so your attitude is exactly, it's very wise, and I think it's what many people should do. And in some ways, we should be having fun. We write the story we want, and then so how am I going to do this? And I had a story, a novel idea that was turned down by my agent, who said it's just, and they represent Colleen Hoover. So I've been thinking about, going to a small press with it. I mean, okay. But it's, anyhow, good stuff.
Does anyone else have any questions? Anybody?
No
All right.
questions, but I just wanted to say thank you so much. This has been absolutely astronomical, so I appreciate it.
I'm an astronaut. What we were saying, look at, God help me, I forget the gentleman's name who wrote The Martian, but that was published.
Andy
that was
Weir.
self-published.
Yeah.
Yes, Andy Weir. And 50 Shades of Grey, I've not read it. I cannot comment whether it's adequate or not, but that was a self-published book. There are any number of ways. I've known several people who did it that way and got enough attention that editors in traditional ways, traditional ways said, hey, let's do it.
That's what happened to me. I happened to be in the right place at the right time when the Kindle, like I said, was 2009, 2010. And I just happened to have that miracle success. And 6 months later, I got a publishing contract.
It's amazing. Those 2 years, 3 years were astonishing. And as an example, Amazon approached my agent to see if I would, because they weren't common, have some of my books published as ebooks. And I said, sure. And I had a book that was an original that we hadn't submitted yet. And I said, and maybe let's do an original ebook. And I remember, and I think I was one of the first 6. And it was so unusual that the LA Times Below the Fold had a story about authors who were doing this, like, well, how unheard of. And I remember several major authors whom I will not name, who said to me, this is a mistake, you're destroying your career. And I said, I don't think so. I see where this is going. And what we do is, and then of course, audiobooks. I know several authors who are now producing their own audiobooks and then releasing them through Audible. I have no idea how one does this. Again, I speak digital with an accent, but I mean, this is where we go. I mean, it's, in a sense, it's never been more exciting. There've never been more opportunities. And plus all the streaming services, which will eventually crash. It is a bubble, but all these streaming services need stories. And so, when you have the material there available, as long as you can get an agent to submit them, the opportunities are there. And in the old days, there was paperback, or there was hardback, there was paperback. And then in the 80s, the audiobooks, which were considered a fad. My book, A Brotherhood of the Rose, was one of the, I think, first 4 books published by Brilliance as an audiobook. And in those days, they did it like a radio show with multiple voices and all of that, and music. People said, well, that won't last. And now it's the fastest growing element in publishing. So what you have to do is be, after you're the artist, you have to be the entrepreneur. And there are ways to beat the system. But I don't know how we can do it traditionally at this moment when we have the Colleen Hoover wall.
True. Any other questions for David? David, thank you so much, so very much for joining us this evening. This was absolutely wonderful. So much insight, so much information, so much advice. It's exactly what we wanted. I want to encourage all of you, if you have not read First Blood, David's first novel, The Introduction of John Rambo, it's a remarkable book. I highly encourage you to find it, read it. You will be amazed. It's a wonderful story, wonderfully written. It just grabbed me by the throat and it didn't let go. I can't recommend it highly enough. It's awesome.
He should be writing my blurbs. He should be writing my blurbs. A little thing about First Blood. A couple of years ago, I was asked to write an introduction for Ira Levin's Rosemary's Baby, a 50th anniversary edition. And I was just thrilled to do it. And I remember saying, Ira is no longer with us, but I remember saying, how cool for Ira, 50 years and a book still in print. And then last year, First Blood, 50 years still in print. So
yep.
Pretty wild.
50 years. It's a great accomplishment, David, and the beginning of a remarkable career. Again, you've been so kind to us. We appreciate it tremendously.
Well, it's nice to meet some of you at least. It's nice to meet some of you at least. And as I said when we started, you run a terrific conference.
Appreciate that. We're working on 2024. Working on our guests of honor for that, and I'll keep you posted. I'll let you know how things go. We've already nailed down Amy Jones is the editor of Writer's Digest, and she's going to be our nonfiction guest of honor. And we're leaning towards some others who got some thoughts on our fiction guest. So I'll let you know how that goes.
Writer's Digest was the first publisher of my writing book.
Oh, really? Yeah, that magazine, we own that magazine, David. TAF members are all over that thing. Either in the masthead, Christy Stevenson writes a column. We own Writer's Digest.
Good investment. Okay.
Thank you.
Nice to hang around with all of you. And
great to have you, David. Thank you very much. Okay. I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye. Good night, everybody.